Hey, what's up, guys? This is Teo Hayashi. Welcome to another episode of the Teo Hayashi Podcast. And in this episode, I got the great privilege and the honor, and I'm connected right here for an awesome conversation with Dr. Scott Allan. And he, together with Daryl Miller and so many other wonderful leaders, lead Discipling Nations Alliance. And I personally have been so blessed by their work. And I am super excited on this episode and in this podcast to be able to have a conversation with Scott about his new book. He's about to release a book that I feel is very critical and crucial to any one of us Christians that want to live missionally. And not only missionally in our own churches, but in the societies that we live in our cities. We're talking about discipling nations. And to disciple nations, we need to really understand the power of language, which is the theme of Scott's book. So, Scott, before we dive into the content of our conversation, first off, thank you for the time that we're having and for you allowing me to have this conversation with you. I know it's going to be such a learning experience for myself, and I hope as well for our listeners and our viewers.
Thank you, Pastor Teo. What an honor to be with you. It's, this is just such a great opportunity, and really excited to have the conversation with you. Just one small correction. I am not a doctor. I barely got my undergraduate degree, so...
You sound like one.
Anyways, I love learning, and I feel like I'm a lifelong learner, but I don't have that credential. So
that's great, though. I mean, I've learned so much from you and from your writings. I'm from back in the day when Daryl Miller had his blog, Daryl Miller and Friends, and I would read occasionally some of your articles, which were so challenging, and also it really was faith building. So. That is awesome. Scott, first off, when we're talking about discipling nations, we're talking about the Great Commission. We're talking about Matthew 28. And I know for a lot of the Western church, when we're talking about discipleship, I think we have a tendency to look at it as through the lens of Mark 16, making disciples of all people. But then when we go to Matthew 28, there's another emphasis on the same Great Commission, which is make disciples of all nations. Is it all right for us to differentiate these two perspectives? And if so, do they mean, what do they mean? Or if not, do they mean the same thing? How would we begin even our conversation trying to position our listeners? This is what we're talking about. Discipling nations. What do we really mean by that?
Yeah, it's great question. The word nations is critical in this discussion. It's a biblical word. Actually, it's a biblical concept. It goes all the way back to Genesis, the very beginning. And I think a really critical passage is Genesis chapter 12, the calling of Abraham, who became the father of a great nation, that would be Israel. And also the father of the church, because we are, as Gentiles, we're grafted in to that vine through the blood of Jesus Christ.
Yes.
And when God came to Abraham in Genesis 12, 1 and 2, he made a promise to him, and he said, I'm going to make you great. I'm going to make you into a great nation. And through you, all nations on earth will be blessed. So that theme goes all the way through to Revelation, where we see the New Jerusalem and this incredible picture of the ingathering of the nations coming to bring the honor and glory of the nations as gifts to lay at the feet of the King of Kings.
Wow.
So I think you have to understand the Great Commission, Matthew 28, 18 through 20, in that light. Jesus has commissioned us to bless nations, to be salt and light in our nations, to see them thrive and to flourish. And of course, you can't disciple nations, apart from discipling individual people. But there's a difference. There's a difference between me as an individual and a nation. There's you have the concept of culture, of society, of norms, and laws, and all sorts of things that you don't have when you're talking about people as individuals.
Yeah, that's great. As you're talking about the Great Commission, it's very hard for us to once we get that perspective to disconnect from what happened in the garden. I know you mentioned Genesis 12, but I think that we could also look into the cultural mandate in Genesis
Yes,
1:28.
absolutely.
Would you see the discipling of nations the continuation of a mandate that was given to man in the garden in Genesis 1:28?
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, so much of a biblical worldview understanding of the scriptures has to start with Genesis chapter 1 and 2. And one of the problems with evangelicals of late is that we tend to think in our own minds that the Bible starts with Genesis 3, the fall,
Yeah,
and then the mission of the church becomes one of salvation and redemption, which it certainly is. But you have to go back and you have to understand what we're being saved uh, to, which is a recovery of what we lost in Genesis 1 and 2,
that's
right?
right.
God created this beautiful garden, this beautiful world, and He placed us in that garden as His image bearers in order to do something, to exercise dominion, to use our own creativity. I love this biblical idea that God is this incredible creator. He created all that we see, the heavens and the earth. It's the most beautiful work of art that exists, bar none. And
Yes.
then He put us in this world, and He made us in this really interesting ways like Him, not in terms of our appearances, obviously, but in terms of our capacity to create, to use language and words, which we're going to talk about, in order to take what He has made and do something with it that is also beautiful, to create families, cities, nations, to take the grapes and make wine and everything else. I mean, that's who we are.
Yes.
Now, that all got warped and bent, in the fall. And so we still have our creativity, but we use it to make nuclear bombs and destroy things.
Yep.
So what we see then in redemption at the cross is this kind of recovery through Christ. We can recover our true humanity, and that means that true kind of first job description that God gave us in the garden to really work to bring about, the flourishing that God desires in our nations.
That's awesome. Yeah, that connection just helps us really get the big picture of things.
Yes.
And I think you said something here very interesting. You said, the gospel starts in Genesis 1, not necessarily Genesis 3. And
Yeah.
I don't know if you would add to this, but I see a lot the Western church as of late very fixed only in the gospel of salvation because we're looking through the lens of the fall of man. Man needs to be saved.
Right.
And to a certain extent, I mean, once we have a lot of people saved, for instance, I am in Brazil, a country that is very different from, let's say, Switzerland, which has, is so advanced. But when we look at the church in Brazil, we see a lot of conversion. We see a lot of people. And we see men that were born in original sin being converted, yet society doesn't seem to be expressing the restoration of the kingdom in its laws, in its educational system, in its policies, in arts, entertainment, business practices, so forth. Are we talking about discipling nations beyond just the human being?
Well, I think we just have this, our theology of late in the evangelical church is really wrong on this point. It has a very truncated understanding of mission, or purpose. What's our purpose as Christians? And that truncated or kind of abbreviated understanding is just, it's to get people saved. It's to get them into the churches and then get them to heaven.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what's missing from that? Any kind of connection to the world around us.
Wow.
And you even hear Christians today say it doesn't matter. It's all going to be destroyed.
Yeah.
We shouldn't even be worried about nations, culture, society, this world, because it's all going to vanish. It's all going to be destroyed. So when you think that way, then all that matters, is just going to church and trying to get my neighbors saved. Don't misunderstand me. I mean, this is critical, okay?
Yeah.
You don't disciple nations apart from this.
Yes.
But if you don't have an understanding of why God, desires us to be saved. Again, it goes back to Genesis 12. The world is fallen. God loves the world, for God so loved this world. Okay. Yes, it's fallen, but he wants to redeem it. He wants to see it restored, and he has a plan to do that. And that plan involves raising up a people and a nation, blessing them.
Yes.
Right? That's what we have through salvation, a new life, salvation, a new heart, a new mind, the power of the Holy Spirit. For what purpose? Not just to go to church on Sunday and then go to heaven when we die.
Yep.
The purpose then, the mission, is to go out and share that blessing with the world and to live as God created us to live in a way that makes a real difference, a profound difference in our cities, our cultures, our nations, our families.
Yes.
So this is God's purpose. This is his heart. This is why you're saved.
Yeah.
I have to remind people of that. You're not just saved to go to heaven.
Yes.
Okay. Thankfully, that's true. You're saved so that God can use you to do good works here on earth. And that's really why I wrote the book, Teo, is to remind Christians that we have a job to do, and a big part of that job is defending biblical words and language.
That's good.
Because there's hardly anything that does more to bless a nation than these powerful words that God's given us in his word.
Well, I think that's so powerful what you mentioned, you're saved to do good works and to glorify God in heaven, and I think that we could see that same language in the way Jesus teaches us to pray when he says, "Our Father that art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven." That movement of heaven to earth. And I think that he just puts it in the right language to help us learn how to pray his heart through the Lord's Prayer.
Yep.
And speaking of language, I know your book is on language, and I see Jesus as one that knew how to use language. I'm just reminded even of the verse in Matthew 16 when he says, "I will build my ecclesia, I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it." Understanding even the ecclesia, which was a language of that time, he took upon him to use it as a means where kingdom message would go through. And I know you addressed that in your book, the power of language. It seems like Jesus knew the power of language. If we would start from the basics, why is language so important? We could go on and on talking about how there are many attempts lately to take hostage our language. But why is it that we see a war on language?
Well, listen, we use language, of course, all the time. We're talking right now using words to communicate, but we take it for granted. We just use it. We don't often think about it. But words and language are incredibly powerful. In fact, there may not be anything more powerful. What do I mean by that? Well, take a verse like from John chapter 1, "In the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God. The Word was God. Through him, all things were created." God literally created heaven and earth through his spoken word.
Wow.
God's he's a God that uses words and language to create. And that's such a profound idea. He created everything through his spoken word, and then he communicated to us through the 10 Commandments, which he inscribed on the stone tablets with his fingers, through the prophets, through the apostles in the New Testament. So then, of course, he made us as image bearers of God and gave us this unique and powerful capacity to use language that separates us from the other animals that he made, right?
Yeah.
So we speak, we use language. As my mentor and friend Dara Miller, says, if you want to change a culture, you begin by changing language.
Wow.
Because language is the building block of culture. When God created, he created everything ex nihilo, out of nothing, with his words and language. When we use words and language as his image bearers, we create culture.
Yes.
And so words create culture, and that's why they're so powerful. And if I could just add one more thing to that, I don't want to be too abstract with this because this is very practical. And let me just give you one example.
Yes, please.
From my own experience. I used to work for many years with a Christian development organization called Food for the Hungry.
Yeah.
And when I was working in Kenya or traveling in Kenya, one of the reasons that there's a lot of poverty in Kenya and other parts of Africa and really around the world is they have a concept of what it means to be a woman, a female, and that is very demeaning and degraded. And so women are treated poorly in many cultures around the world. And when I was looking at that word in the native or indigenous language for woman, it was the same word as the word for tool. It's something that you use,
Wow.
and you can cast away when you're done using it. Now, when the Bible comes, right, the Bible's been translated into these indigenous languages.
Yeah.
Now we have a new word that didn't exist before, and that creates a new idea in people's minds. That's the power of words.
Wow.
And now a woman isn't a tool. A woman is an image bearer of God with unbelievable dignity and worth. And when that idea comes into somebody's mind, it shapes the way a man treats a woman. It shapes the way a husband treats a wife. It shapes an entire culture over time. It does this. It disciples a nation. That's what it does.
Wow, that is.
And so this is very practical. In this fallen world, language has been degraded.
Yeah.
God spoke, gave us his word, his words like compassion, justice, human, sex, these words. And those words changed people. They changed nations.
Wow, this is really powerful, especially your example with your work in Kenya. It truly is. It's so critical that we get the right words attached to the right meaning, so that we would have the right
meaning, God's meaning. Right?
Exactly, yeah. God's meanings. And I know you said this is one of Daryl's quotes. If you want to change culture, you begin by changing language. Would you say that there is a blatant attempt right now to change culture by actually fighting for what has been Western civilization's language for so long, based on Judeo-Christian values?
There's no question, and that's really why I wrote the book. The using language to change culture. This is something that's deep in our Christian history and deep in our own mission. Go back to the Reformation. God spoke this word that literally transforms lives and nations. And that word was translated first into German and then into English and Spanish and all sorts of languages today, thousands of languages.
Yes.
And Christians didn't just translate God's word. They set up schools and universities all over the world in order to teach people the true meaning of these words. And that's how nations were discipled. The idea that we sometimes have today, if we talk about discipling nations, people think, oh, we need to get into government, right? And we need to get into politics and we need to change laws. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? That's important work. But at a much more fundamental level, the way that the church has discipled nations historically is just simply by translating God's words and teaching people the meaning of these words so that they could live on the basis of the truth. Wow. Now, today, the church is, because we don't have a vision for discipling nations, we've kind of lost that idea.
Yeah.
And the people that are very active out there in terms of changing language in order to change culture are enemies of the gospel, are opponents, right? They understand this like entirely well, and they're changing the definition of words right now all over the place, and they're changing culture as a result. And my concern is that when they do that, and you see these words in dictionaries, and it shows up these new meanings in school curriculum and in laws and everything else, it starts coming into the church, right? I mean, even Christians absorb these false definitions. So we've got a real problem. We've got to turn this around and kind of recover our own history of using God's word to disciple nations.
Yeah, and when you write your book, you're talking 10 words to heal a broken world, right? And I'm sure there's been a lot of thinking through what are these 10 words. I know I have written this down. Truth, you said human, sex, marriage, freedom, authority, words like justice, faith, beauty, and love. Could you pick maybe one or two of those and just kind of walk us through what is the anti-biblical way of seeing this word or trying to take over, hostage this word, and what should we ground it to biblically speaking?
Really happy to. I was just curious if you had one that you wanted to start with, Pastor Teo.
I'm super curious on the beauty one. I think for all the creatives and the artists that are following us, I think we would always, appreciate what is this? Why is beauty so important? And why is it that we need to be biblically grounded or have a biblical worldview of beauty?
This is a word that I have personally so absorbed the kind of the false understanding of beauty myself over the course of my life that my going into this word in the process of writing this book and has been really revolutionary in my own thinking. I'm so grateful I had the opportunity.
Wow.
It's a definition, it's a word whose definition and meaning has been changed so dramatically that now it's completely most Christians have totally absorbed this kind of false definition of beauty. Let me just read the two definitions of beauty that I put in the book. First, I'll start with the true one. By the way, beauty is a tricky word to define, and I struggled with it because, the beauty associates with the Greek, the Latin word pathos, which is feelings, emotions. We tend to experience beauty.
Okay.
Whereas when we're using language and we're thinking and reasoning and using logic, it's that Latin word logos.
Yes.
And so we tend not to. It's just a hard. It's almost like beauty has its own language, and it's a little hard to define using words and language. But I tried anyways, and here's what I said: beauty is a combination of qualities that's present in a thing or a person, both externally and internally, that gives joy, deep satisfaction. Beauty moves us deeply. It fills us with awe and wonder.
Wow.
Here's the key part: because God is its ultimate source, beauty has an objective reality to it that transcends personal taste.
Objective reality.
Today, it's that last part that's been lost. And so beauty's been redefined to be a combination of aesthetic qualities that appeal to somebody's personal or subjective sense of what they think is beautiful. It's entirely a matter of personal preference or individual expression. So much of these words, when they've been redefined, it's God has been stripped out of the definition.
Yeah.
And so now, in the Bible, God is the source of beauty. It says in the Psalms that out of Zion, the perfection of beauty, God shines forth. God is beautiful in his own nature. He created beauty. We don't understand beauty apart from God himself.
Wow.
Now, when you strip God away from beauty, then it just becomes this completely individual and subjective sense of, what I think I like. It's preference, it's taste, it's expression. I thought that way for the longest time. And therefore, I didn't think beauty was that important. It's kind of decorative. It's an add-on. It's nice. I like to watch a beautiful sunset, but it's not essential. It's certainly not essential to Christian life. And I was really wrong. If God is the source of beauty, living a faithful Christian life means I've got to take this word really seriously and in how I live. So,
wow, and that also just adds so much meaning, even for, like I was mentioning before, artists and creatives. That it is a worship to the Lord when you do something that's beautiful.
God created us to create beauty.
Wow.
That's a part of you talked about our mission in Genesis chapter 1. That's a part of it, to create things that are beautiful, that reflect his beauty, that glorify him. And so
that's awesome. And I think I heard once Darren Miller was teaching, and he talked about we're living in a post-truth world. And he also mentions, besides the postmodern world, post-truth world, I think he mentioned something about the post-beauty world, Whereas
Absolutely.
we're in
Yep.
an era right now that what is beauty or what is ugly? I mean, it's so subjective, and you're talking about no,
Yeah.
it's objective, and it's objectively founded in something constant, and this constant is the Lord Himself. This is so key. Would you agree then that we are really in a post-beautiful world or post-beauty world, and the enemy would like for us to be there,
to
right?
me, it's just heartbreaking. I'll give one example of this, Teo. I live here in Pastor Teo. I live here in Oregon.
You can just call me Teo. That's fine.
Maybe your listeners know Portland, Oregon. It was the source of a lot of rioting in 2020 after the George Floyd incident. And if you go to downtown Portland, it's an incredibly beautiful city.
Okay.
Many of its buildings were built 100 years ago. They're beautiful, ornate buildings that people took a long time and put a lot of effort into creating aesthetically beautiful architecture, streets, gardens. It's incredible. What's happened now is that the streets are not only covered with graffiti. Now you see, there's homeless people that are defecating on the streets.
Mm-hmm.
The windows of the buildings are boarded up because of the riots. If you walk downtown Portland today, you see it's almost like it's a kind of a haunting experience, because you see the old beauty that was created at an earlier time, and then you see what's happened to it. And this isn't just true of Portland. This is true. I mean, I was in Santiago, Chile recently, and I thought the same thing. Incredible architecture.
Yeah.
But it's just, you can't even see it now through all the graffiti.
Yeah.
So this is what happens when you change a definition of a word like beauty.
Wow.
It has a cultural consequence. It leads to cultural change. If beauty is just expression, that's what graffiti is. It's just personal expression.
Yeah.
Now I know people are going to get angry with me because I'm sure a lot of people that feel like it's fine art, but it's not just graffiti. It's trash. It's there. One of the beauty has a quality to it. There's principles of beauty that come from God and His creation. And one of those principles is purity. Like, for example, when you see a beautiful stream, if you're hiking through the forest, and it's crystal clear, it's completely pure, there's something beautiful about that. And you recognize that if you see a stream that's fully polluted and just littered with trash, like that's not.
Yeah.
And so purity, because God is pure. And there's these several principles that kind of undergird what is beautiful. This is why it's not entirely subjective. But today, people have rejected God. They've rejected those principles, and you see that actually in our cities. And that's just one example.
Wow, that's so strong. What you're talking about in terms of beauty, and now I just, if I can, I would love to squeeze in another word here, and I think for even a lot of the young audience today, we have been bombarded with the idea of what sex is, and with so many new gender roles and everything. How do you define sex, and how does the world define sex, and how has that changed? Because even when I was in high school or when I was in college, I'm a millennial. I know for sure that I was not facing in school what I see some of the Gen Z they're facing right now, and even I would say my kids, Gen Alpha, would eventually face. I'm like, this is a whole different world, and a lot of it has to do with gender. And then I think you'll probably touch on this, the difference between sex and gender, because that's very critical as well.
Yeah, well, this word sex probably, more than any of these 10 words, has been so dramatically redefined. We are living at the tail end, or maybe in the middle of, I'm not sure, a true sexual revolution in the West, right?
Mm-hmm.
Everything has been upended completely, and it's left this utter wasteland in its wake, just complete confusion. There's been probably nothing that's destroyed our nations more than the redefinition of this critical word.
Yeah.
So getting back to trying to kind of recover it is really tricky. When you look at the scriptures, sex, you see it in Genesis chapter 1, where God created man, male and female. There's that binary of male and female.
Mm-hmm.
And then, he brought them together, Adam and Eve, in marriage, and gave them this incredible capacity to procreate, right? And so you have the biblical idea of sex really kind of encompasses both of those: sex as male and female, and sex as male and female together in marriage in this act of procreation. And he made it obviously something that is incredibly enjoyable and something that is powerful. So there's, it's an amazing word, right? Today, again, God has been stripped out of that understanding. And, now in our kind of postmodern world, sex is entirely subjective. And this is where gender kind of comes into play.
Okay.
For most of my growing up, I used the word sex and gender kind of, interchangeably.
Interchangeably, yeah.
But they're not. They're not completely the same. They're related. So the word sex historically in the West denoted male-female. Gender was really how those were expressed. Often it was kind of culturally. So in many countries, boys wear blue and girls wear pink. And so the gender had to do more with the expression of one's sexuality. And so it's kind of there's some subjectivity to it. So sexual revolutionaries kind of grabbed on to that subjectivity and said the entire thing, sex is entirely subjective. And so this is where you get into this idea that, your biology, you're created, how God created you doesn't matter. Your body, it doesn't matter. It's what you think, right? This is, this is postmodernism.
Yeah.
What you think defines reality, what you think about your body. And it's not, so now we have to get rid of male, female, because I can be kind of almost anything I want. And you see the list of alphabet characters just growing longer every day, LGBTQ, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And it won't stop because it's going to be as long as our human imagination. So we've untethered sex from, any kind of objective grounding in creation or in God.
Yeah.
And now we're just living this completely confused life, and it's destroying people. So
Scott, if we don't define biblically sex, yes. I'm just trying to do this exercise in my mind, projection to the future. If we desperately need revival, we desperately need an intervention from the Lord, and of course we have faith for that. But let's say, if things keep going the way they are, I mean, how do you see society? How do you see family? How do you see the basic unity of civilization in a decade, in 2 decades, in the West?
It's the Bible, has this really tight connection between sex and marriage. You almost have to talk about those two words at the same time, because in the Bible, sex is reserved for marriage, and it's because it's so powerful. It has the ability, the capacity to create new life. And there's only one place where that powerful capacity is safe enough to be used, and that's within this kind of constraint of a male and a female in a lifelong commitment or covenant. So that's all been discarded now. So what happens? You have, I think of Margaret Sanger, for example. She was the founder of Planned Parenthood back in the 1800s.
Mm-hmm.
She deified sex. She said, to live a full human life, you can't without having kind of unlimited sexual expression.
Wow.
So for her, her life mission was to create. The problem with that was,
Babies.
Procreation, frankly, that was a problem. It was a barrier. So she was the pioneer of birth control, because we have to separate sex from procreation, which has effectively been done today. Now we don't, people separate those ideas completely. And what happens? Well, you have the genocide, the Holocaust of abortion all over the world. Children end up paying the biggest price whenever we redefine and destroy a word like sex. Without these basic ideas, sex, marriage, family, this is the very foundation of a culture.
Wow.
When you change it at that foundational level, you destroy a culture.
Wow.
And that's what we're seeing. So to bless a nation, to recover our mission to bless nations, the church, we as followers of Jesus Christ, have to recover a true understanding of marriage, of sex, of family, and its intricate role in blessing nations. So they all go together.
And just as we're talking about, the church being a blessing, I mean, I would say if the church is to be missional, it has to have a grasp on language. We won't be able to be missional without language. I think this is kind of like the premise of your work.
This is how we're missional. Yeah.
Awesome. I mean, can you expand on that?
How is it? But largely, we're missional by understanding, living out the true meaning of these words, and then defending them, speaking them, defending them in the public square. Because if we don't do that, somebody's going to be defining these words, right? Somebody's going to be embedding them in curriculum, in government policy. And if it's not Christians with the true definitions that bring life, then it's going to be non-Christians with redefinitions that are going to destroy nations. Now, I'm not content to just sit around and let that happen. I feel like that's a complete abdication of why I'm here as a follower of Jesus Christ.
Come on.
So this is my passion, Pastor Teo. I know it's yours as well, to recover. Discipling nations isn't about, we've got to create some army and take over the government or whatever. No, it's simply understanding the power of the words that God has given us, living our own lives faithfully on the basis of the true meaning of these words, but then, carrying them out into culture, into society to be a blessing to the world.
This is awesome. This is very powerful because I think at the end of the day, what we're talking about here is occupation, right? And
yes.
You're saying occupy until he comes, and until he comes, we're occupying. We need to occupy the sphere of language, and I think that's why you have this book being released November 19th. Is that the right date? November 19th.
I think you got that right. I was trying to remember what the date was, but I think it's right around mid-November. So.
It's November 19th. I think we need to work on getting this book translated to as many languages we can, because this is such a needed message. We're talking about 10 words to heal our broken world. And I really believe, that this is not something only for America or for the English-speaking world. I think that the whole, the world as we see it globalized today, and the trends that are going east to west and west to east, I think that the more biblical we get, the safer it is. Actually, not even safer. It's just the way to go. And so what is the word telling us?
If I could just say something, Pastor Teo, the people, in my experience, traveling around the world, the Christians that have really grabbed a hold of kind of a recovery of our Christian mission to disciple nations have been Christian leaders in countries like Brazil, just like yourself, people in Kenya and Chile. There's such a hunger right now.
Global South.
And I think it's because they live in contexts that are quite broken, right?
Yep.
And they know, hey, this isn't, this can't be what, the fulfillment of the Great Commission, right? There's something more.
Yes.
And there's just such hunger. And I'm so excited about what God's doing in Brazil right now. He's really raising up a mighty church. Amen. At a critical time in the history of your nation, using people like you and your powerful ministry. I'm so excited to see what he's going to do, over the years. And we in the United States, we're kind of lagging behind. I'll be honest. We are still kind of stuck in these old ideas, and consequently, we're not really being salt and light. And that's why things are going so south in our own country. all that to say, we need your inspiration. We need your help in my own country. So,
well, Scott, I think this is kind of interesting. You're mentioning this because the way that I kind of put it to even to my American friends is, I think that America's Christian heritage, being a nation founded in biblical values, Judeo-Christian values, I think for hundreds of years, Americans were able to really glean off of biblical principles ingrained into society. And unfortunately, it has become a theory. And
we've taken them for granted entirely.
Yeah. And we would all love to see it more and more of a practice, more than just a theory. But I believe right now we're seeing the Global South really craving for the practice, but also in need of the theory. And that's where that partnership between the Northern Church and the Global South Church comes in, which is, I think, we look at Western Europe, we look at North America, primarily U.S., Canada, societies that were so impacted by the Protestant Reformation and the revelation of biblical principles that came out of that movement. And now it's been registered. These revelations are in books, they are in curriculums, and that's why I'm excited about your book, because I know that this can benefit the Global South. When we're looking at, hey, we're ready to put this thing into practice. We know that you guys experienced discipling of nations in the past. We're praying that you would receive it again, and we could join forces. So all that to say, thank you for your time. Thank you for having this conversation that I believe is going to be just a appetizer for people to go and grab a copy of your book. November 9th, Scott Allan in his new book, 10 Words to Heal Our Broken World. I want to really recommend that to our viewers and our listeners. Thank you so much, Scott.
Well, thank you, Pastor Hayashi. It's been an honor, Pastor Teo, and thank you for endorsing the book, by the way. I really appreciate you taking the time to read it and offer such a wonderful endorsement.
My honor. I really believe in it, so thank you. Yeah. All right, guys, we'll wrap up right now, and I hope and we pray that you were instigated, challenged, encouraged by the conversation. Really, it is for such a time as this that we're here as the church, the body of Christ that's supposed to be missional, fulfilling the Great Commission. I think this conversation would add a little bit more of a hunger and curiosity. How do we go about and really be good stewards of language and make language the vehicle for people to really receive heaven on earth? And with that, we'll wrap up, and we'll see you on the next one. God bless.